Thank God for He is good. His kindness is forever. Amen. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Guy in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in PA. Started reviewing Eicha today, getting ready for Tisha B'Av. Eicha is Lamentations that we read on Tisha B'Av, which is next week. Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida. Sai the Talmud cat is with us. Thank God. Belle in Texas, Shandor in the Bronx, John in Maine, Lucy in Minnesota. Chaim, YouTube comments are working again. Thank goodness. Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida, Marie in Freeport. Welcome, everybody. Let's get busy. Our daf today's page 48 here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're going to pick it up near the bottom of page 47b, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. Apropos, transactions performed under duress. So the Gemara cites that which Rav Huna says. If one suspended meaning if you hung someone from a tree, not by their neck, you're not trying to kill them, you're trying to coerce them into agreeing to do something, right? So yesterday we started talking about sometimes they don't just steal something from you, they put a gun to your head and say, either your signature or your brains are going to be on that purchase and sale agreement. So you sign and you get paid. Right? But you never would have sold if that gun had not been to your head. But you got paid. So is that a valid transaction or not? Let's hear what Rav Huna says. So if one was suspended, meaning he's, roped up to a tree and thereby coerced to sell a certain item, and he sold it, his sale is valid. And what is the reason? The Gemara suggests that it is because whatever a person sells, were it not for the fact that he is compelled by his need for money, he would not sell it. And even so, his sale is valid. And this indicates that a transaction performed under duress is valid. But the Gemara immediately rejects this concept. But perhaps duress that results from his own needs, such as his need for money, is different from duress that results from another person imposing his will on you. Like somebody who tied you to a tree and said, sign, the sale agreement or I'm not going to let you down. So rather, the basis for Rav Huna's ruling that a sale under duress is nonetheless valid so the reasoning for this is as it is taught in a Baraisa. Now we're on page 48a. With regard to one who pledges to bring a burnt offering, the verse states, this is Leviticus 1:3, if his offering be a burnt offering of the herd, he shall offer it a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the door of the tent of meeting according to his will before the Lord. Now, the seemingly superfluous phrase, he shall offer it, right? Like in other words, it could have said, if his offering be a burnt offering, it shall be brought from the herd or from the flock. It shall be brought in this way or that way. In other words, the particulars of how a burnt offering is brought. But why does it say, if his offering shall be a burnt offering of the herd, he shall offer it? What is this phrase? That phrase could have been left out. What do we learn from it? One might have thought that it can be offered entirely against his will by simply taking it from his possession. This seemingly superfluous phrase, he shall offer it, teaches that once he has pledged to bring an offering, they can coerce him to actually bring it. Now, one might have thought that it can be offered entirely against his will by simply taking it from his possession, handing it over to a priest in the temple, and sacrificing it. Therefore, the verse states, according to his will. So how can these texts be reconciled? You reconcile them by saying they coerce him with various inducements until he says, I want to bring the offering. So this seems to prove that consent resulting from coercion is nevertheless considered to be valid consent. So perhaps this principle can apply to acquisition as a source for Rav Huna's ruling? And the Gemara immediately rejects this argument. But perhaps there it is different. Since he is in fact amenable to achieving atonement, he was going to bring that offering. Why is he bringing a burnt offering? Because he needed to bring the burnt offering. He did something, he wants to atone, etc. So even though he hesitated because it was going to cost more than he expected, still it's for his own benefit. And so he's amenable to achieving atonement despite his earlier statement to the contrary. But rather, so therefore we can't learn out from that they coerce him to bring his offering, that we can also, when somebody coerces somebody else to sell a property, that such coercion creates a valid transaction. We can't learn it out from the case of coercing someone to bring the burnt offering that they said they would bring. So we have to look elsewhere. So rather, we should prove Rav Huna's ruling from the latter clause of a Mishna in Tractate Arachin 21a, which says, and similarly you find this law with bills of divorce, a gett, that when the court rules that he must divorce his wife, they coerce him until he says, I will divorce my wife. Right? So this is very interesting, right? So you have, under traditional Jewish law, Torah law, the wife can't unilaterally divorce the husband, right? The husband gives the gett. So they might be in a situation where the marriage is dead, and she wants to, remarry and have a family, and this man hates her and she hates him, and there's no marriage here, but he refuses to give her the gett. This is an agunah. This is a stranded woman, and in certain cases of that, the Beis Din will step in and coerce the man to give her the gett. Now, if we say that a coerced consent is never a valid consent, well, then this divorce would not be a valid divorce, and yet it is a valid divorce. So we see that there are certain instances where, even under Jewish law, a coerced consent is a valid consent, like in the case of this gett. So what about that? Is that proof that coerced consent can be valid consent even in a transaction? So the Gemara rejects using the case of the gett to prove that coerced consent to a sale of property is valid. You can't use the gett for that proof. Why? Because perhaps there, in the case of the divorce, it is different. Why? Because it is a mitzvah to listen to the statement of the sages. The assumption is that when he is required by the court to divorce his wife, his real desire is to perform the mitzvah of heeding the word of the sages who are ordering him to do this. And therefore, he actually wants to divorce her. He's being recalcitrant for whatever reason, pride, or some silly reason. But inside, of course, he wants to be a Torah-observant Jew, so he listens to the sages. But this does not apply to the case of a transaction performed under duress. So rather, Rav Huna's ruling does not have a source in a Mishnah or a Baraisa, and it is based on logical reason. By means of his being coerced, the seller then willingly decides to sell the field and transfers it. Really? How can you say that? You're saying that the coercion brings him to the place where he's willing to do it, and then it's a valid sale. But if he's being coerced, how could that be willing? Really? Is it really willing? Rav Yehuda raises an objection to Rav Huna's ruling. And he raises it from a Mishnah in Tractate Gittin, right? The Talmud tractate about divorce. Says Rav Yehuda in Tractate Gittin, with regard to a bill of divorce that the husband was compelled by the court to write and give to his wife, if he was compelled by a Jewish court, then it is a valid gett. But if he was compelled by Gentiles, it is not a valid gett. And with regard to Gentiles, they may beat him at the request of the Jewish court and say to him, do what the Jews are telling you, and then the divorce would be valid. So the Gemara asks, but why is a bill of divorce compelled by a Gentile court not a valid gett? There too, let us say that as a result of his coercion, the husband decides to do what the court says and he divorces her. Since we don't say that, how can you say that coercion ever actually creates a willing consent? So the Gemara answers, nevertheless, that logical reasoning is correct. As for this reason, wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishna that Rav Misharshia says, by Torah law, a gett, a bill of divorce, that the husband was compelled to give, even if he was compelled by Gentiles, is valid. And what is the reason the sages said that if it is compelled by Gentiles, it is not valid by rabbinic decree? It is so that each and every woman will not go and through temptation or bribery depend on a Gentile to compel her husband to divorce her and thereby release herself from her husband illegitimately. Right? We don't want to encourage women to just go hire some bruiser to go threaten her husband until he gives the gett, and then it's a valid gett. We don't want to create that situation. So Rav Hamnuna raises an objection to Rav Huna's ruling. So again, objecting that this coerced consent in a transfer of property could somehow become a valid consent. Rav Hamnuna raises an objection, also from a Mishnah in Tractate Gittin on page 55b. If one purchased land from a Sicarius, we talked about this yesterday, right? The Sicarii were these Roman assassins, Roman ruffians. Sadly, sometimes they even had Jewish capo types who collaborated with them, but basically threatened Jews to sign deeds of land over to some buyer where the Sicarii is just going to make money out of that. And we said that those are not valid land transfers, right? That's what we said yesterday. Here's the Mishnah. If one purchased land from a Sicarius, and afterward he returned and purchased the same field from the prior owner, his purchase is void, not valid, not a legitimate purpose. As the prior owner of the field can say that he did not actually intend to sell the field to the buyer. He was coerced. So why is the sale invalid? There too, let us say, according to Rav Huna, that by means of his being coerced, the seller eventually, willingly, decided to sell the land and transferred it. But we don't say that. So the Gemara answers, actually, the reasoning behind Rav Huna's ruling is correct. As it was stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rav says, they taught that the purchase from the prior owner after the purchase from a Sicarius is void only when the prior owner said to the buyer at the time of the sale, go take possession and thereby acquire the field. But he did not write a bill of sale. But if the transaction was performed along with a bill of sale being given, then the buyer does acquire the field. Now the Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, who says he does not acquire the field even if the transaction was performed along with a bill of sale being given, then what can be said? The Gemara answers, Shmuel concedes that the sale is valid where the buyer gave money for the field, even though the owner sold it under duress, as is the case in the ruling of Rav Huna. The guy got money. He wouldn't have sold if he wasn't coerced, but in the end, he got money. Now, you could ask, how much money? If he just took some pittance, well, then obviously it was coerced. If he got the market value of his land, you can see why it's a tougher question. Yeah, he never would have sold if he wasn't coerced. But in the end, what he got was the value of his land, and then the world went on. right? And maybe the next buyer sold it to another buyer, sold it to another buyer, and it wouldn't be, maybe it's not so easy to unwind the clock, to rewind the clock all the way back to when this coerced sale was made. So you can see maybe there's an argument for recognizing that sale as valid if he got money and it was market value, but we're not sure if that's what it's saying yet. So let's keep reading. Now the Gemara asks, and according to Rav Bava, who concludes that statement of Rav Huna with a comment in the name of Rav Nachman, that the robber does not have rights to the land, but he does have rights to the money that he paid for the land, and the owner has to reimburse him. Then what can be said? Okay, he paid, money was paid, but the robber doesn't get to keep the land. The one who coerced doesn't get to keep the land. He can get his money back that he gave, but he doesn't get to keep the land because it was coerced purchase. So how can you say that this coerced consent ever creates a valid purchase? We certainly don't learn that from this earlier case. Rav Bava, who's referring to a case where there was a payment, as the robber is being reimbursed, seems to hold that the sale is invalid, even where the robber paid for the field. So the Gemara answers that the statement of Rav Bava is an Amoraic statement, not a citation of a Tanaitic ruling. And Rav Huna, who is also an Amora, does not hold in accordance with the Amoraic statement. In other words, the Tanaim are the sages of the Mishna. The Amoraim are the sages of the Gemara. The Amoraim are later in time than the Tanaim. Sages that are earlier have greater authority than sages that are later. Right? So if we're saying that an Amora later on said we're not going to accept any transaction being valid if it was coerced, okay, well, an Amora said that, and maybe he's ruling that way in his region, but that is in no way a universal statement of law if it contradicts an earlier statement by a Tana. Now, Rava says the law is that if one suspended, meaning hung a person or tied a person to a tree, and thereby coerced him to sell a certain item, and he sold it, the sale is valid. So now Rav is agreeing with Rav Huna. But he adds a caveat. And we said that this is the law only in a case where the seller was compelled to sell an unspecified field. Since he had a choice as to which field to sell, the presumption is that he sold it sincerely. But in a case where the one coercing him specified, I want this field, sell me this field, and the guy who was being coerced sold him that field, the sale is not valid, as the seller did not decide freely on any aspect of the sale. So if the seller had some free will, expressed some choice that was not coerced, then we can say that maybe it's a valid sale. But if everything that he sold, everything that he did in that transaction was only the result of coercion, then for sure it's not a valid sale. And just in case, we saw this about a week ago, just in case a person is going to be coerced, right? And it's not so cut and dry as, look, I'm going to put a gun to your head and either your signature or your brains are going to be on that contract. That's obvious coercion. But what if the one who's pushing him around, is somebody with influence in the community, and he says, if you don't sell me that field, it's going to be very tough for you to make a living in this town. Very unspecified, very ambiguous, very general. But a person who has some pull in the town and his threat has teeth, but it's still pretty ambiguous, right? So you're afraid that if you sell and then later say, well, it was coerced, I want my land back, you might not be able to prove that it was coercion. That's why you make the preemptive declaration. Preemptive declaration means that before you go enter into that contract, you state before two witnesses, hey, I don't want to sell this land. This guy's forcing me to do it. I'm afraid that he's going to use his influence against me if I don't sell it, but I am not doing this willingly. And the two witnesses hear him say that, and they write down, he said before us that he's not entering into this sale willingly, then he will have evidence that it was a coerced sale, and later he will definitely be able to unwind that sale. We are on page 48b. And even in a case where the one coercing him specified this specific field to be sold, we said that the sale is invalid only where the seller did not count the money for the field. But if the seller did count the money, then we do not say that the sale is invalid, which is interesting because it's like he didn't really want to sell, but he counted that he made sure he got as much money as he agreed to sell after the coercion happened. So again, it's going to be a lot of facts have to be weighed. That's the problem with any litigation, right? You're never sure how it's going to go. It's always uncertainty when there's litigation. So you're trying to have as many facts in line, as many witnesses, to agree with your statement of facts as possible when you go into litigation. And we said that the sale is invalid in the case of a specified field when the money was not counted, only where the seller had no way to avoid the coercion. But if the seller had a way to avoid being coerced, and he did not avoid it, then we do not say that the sale was invalid. Right? Again, it's not going to be so cut and dry, so simple to establish whether coercion existed or not. Like obviously, if somebody put a gun to his head and said sign it or not, or else, and people saw that, then everyone would agree that was coercion. But we can come up with another statement of facts, like I talked about before, where the coercion is not so clear. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is, the halacha is, in all these cases, that the sale is valid, and this is so even in the case of a specified field, and this can be inferred because the case of a woman forced to accept betrothal is comparable to the case of a specified field. As a specific man is performing the betrothal, and a Maimar says, if a man suspended a woman, right, like tied her to a tree and said, you are betrothed to me or else I'm not going to let you go, then his betrothal is valid despite the fact that she was coerced. What? No. That's right here in the Gemara, but that's not the law. A woman accepting betrothal can never be coerced. A woman cannot be coerced into accepting betrothal. Now, and let me just read where the halacha ended up there. If one is subject to physical coercion, and certainly a lesser form of coercion, to sell an item, and he indicates that he is willing to sell and he receives payment, then the sale is valid, provided that he did not write he did not write in front of witnesses a preemptive declaration saying that he's being coerced. Regarding betrothal, a woman can be betrothed only willingly. If she was coerced to accept betrothal, it is not a valid betrothal. The Rima writes that the betrothal is invalid only if it is known definitively that she did not desire the betrothal. But mere circumstantial evidence that she did not intend to become betrothed is not sufficient to invalidate the betrothal. By contrast, if a man was coerced to betroth a certain woman and he acquiesced, some say the betrothal is valid where others hold that it is not, right? So the shotgun wedding, right? And a betrothal is a form of a wedding in the sense that if a man and woman are betrothed and they decide to break it off, even though they haven't consummated the union, they haven't stood under the chuppah and completed the marriage, nevertheless, to break off a betrothal requires a gett, requires a divorce. So, if a man is coerced to betroth a woman, at least according to some opinions, the betrothal is valid, and to break it off, he's going to require a gett. By contrast, if a woman, if it's known definitively that she was coerced to accept a betrothal, there was no betrothal, and a gett would not be necessary. Now, Bar Rav Ashi said, in the case of a woman who was forced to accept betrothal, the betrothal is certainly not valid. This man acted improperly, and consequently the sages acted improperly with him, and the sages expropriated her betrothal from him. And Ravina said to Rav Ashi, well, this works out well in a case where he betrothed his wife with money, as it is possible to say that the sages expropriated from the possession of its owner the money used for the betrothal, resulting in a retroactive cancellation of the betrothal. But if he betrothed her by means of sexual intercourse, then what is there to say? Right? Because how do you achieve betrothal? You have to give the woman some item of value, and she agrees to be betrothed to you. That's one method of betrothal. Another is if they wanted to become betrothed and they slept together, by Torah law, that would create betrothal. Right? By Torah law, if a Jewish man and woman sleep together, they're betrothed. But that's not true. By rabbinic law, it's not true that any time a single Jewish man and a single Jewish woman have premarital sex, that they actually become betrothed to each other. That's not the law. Why is that not the law? It says so right here. So, but if you betrothed her by means of sexual intercourse, then what is there to say? And Rav Ashi said to him, the sages decreed that his sexual intercourse is licentious sexual intercourse, which does not create a bond of betrothal. It is certainly prohibited. It is certainly an aveira. It's a transgression. But if they do it, it does not create betrothal. New subject. The Gemara relates that someone named Tavi suspended another person named Pafi on a kinara and compelled him to sell his field. What's a kinara? The kinara from the Middle Persian kanar is identified as a type of shrub or tree. So again, he tied someone to a tree and forced him to consent to the sale of a field. Sounds like probably not a valid sale unless there's some further evidence that even though it began as coercion, somehow it ended up in a freely given consent. So let's see. Rabba Bar Chana signed both on Pafi's preemptive declaration. Now we understand the preemptive declaration means I think that guy's going to tie me to a tree. I think he's going to force me. I just want everyone to know, and I want these witnesses to hear me say, I don't want to sell my field. I don't consent to sell my field. Right? And the witnesses signed that declaration. So since he said that in advance, we know that the sale is not going to be valid. Right? And so he even has a sage signing the declaration. So Rabba Bar Chana signed both on the preemptive declaration nullifying the sale and on the bill of sale. Is that kind of weird? The witness signs the preemptive declaration saying that this guy doesn't want to make a sale. And then the same witness signs the sale agreement, which he knows is not going to be a valid agreement. So why would the witness sign that? Well, maybe it's because the one doing the coercing is, really powerful. He's putting a gun to everybody's head. Not only the seller, but also the witnesses. So what the point is that even though the witness signs both, the sale will not be valid, and we do listen to the preemptive declaration. Rav Huna said, the one who signed on the preemptive declaration acted well by signing, and the one who signed on the bill of sale acted well by signing. In other words, he can sign both. And the Gemara immediately challenges this. Well, whichever way you look at it, Rav Huna's statement is problematic. If the preemptive declaration is valid, then there is no place for a bill of sale. And if the bill of sale is valid, then there is no place for a preemptive declaration. So how can Rav Huna commend signing on both of these mutually exclusive documents? And the Gemara explains, this is what Rav Huna is saying. If it were not for his also having signed the preemptive declaration, then the one who signed on the bill of sale acted well by signing. So in this statement, Rav Huna conforms to his line of reasoning, as Rav Huna says, if one was suspended and thereby coerced to sell a certain item and he sold it, his sale is valid. So it would have been valid, except that the witness also signed the preemptive declaration. It's the preemptive declaration that makes the later sale invalid. In the absence of the preemptive declaration, even though there was coercion, the sale would have been valid. So Rav Huna is being consistent with his own ruling. Now the Gemara asks, is that, So the Gemara asks, is that so that Rabbi Bar Chana can, by means of the preemptive declaration, invalidate the bill of sale that he himself signed? But doesn't Rav Nachman say, with regard to witnesses who said our statement that we signed was a document of trust, i.e. a false promissory note given by one person to another, trusting that he will not make use of it until there is an actual loan. All right, we've covered this before. So if one person is borrowing money, a borrower is going to borrow money from a lender, and they're going to need a promissory note to evidence that money is owed, right? And the lender's going to hold that promissory note until the loan is paid back. What if neither one of these people is capable of writing the promissory note himself? There's a scribe passing through town today. The loan may not be needed. If it'll be needed a month from now. But a month from now, they're not going to be able to get a scribe. So they write the promissory note now with the understanding that it's only going to be used if the loan is actually extended later. Now, I think in that situation, what you'd want is that the borrower he's going to hold the promissory note because he may never actually borrow the money. You certainly wouldn't want to leave this promissory note in the possession of the potential lender who's not a lender yet. But again, maybe the circumstances are that you have to leave it with him because the money's somewhere else, and if you're actually going to borrow the money, you're going to pick it up somewhere else, and so the lender needs to hold the note. Or even if it's in the possession of the potential borrower who hasn't borrowed yet, what if he lost it? And then it's out there in the world attesting that he borrowed money when in fact he hasn't borrowed it yet. So that's why we're calling this an instrument of trust, a document of trust. Okay, so what does it say about this? So Rav Nachman said, with regard to witnesses who said, our statement that we signed was a document of trust, right? It was a false promissory note in the sense that the loan hasn't been made yet. If they said that, these witnesses are not deemed credible. And similarly, witnesses who said our statement that we signed was accompanied by a preemptive declaration are not deemed credible. They cannot negate the testimony of the document that they themselves signed by claiming that there had been a preemptive declaration. Similarly, how could Rabbi Bar Chana's signing of the preemptive declaration override his later signing of the bill of sale? And the Gemara answers, that matter of witnesses not being deemed credible to nullify a document applies only when the witnesses attempt to nullify the document by means of an oral declaration, as an oral declaration cannot come and weaken a written document. But if the witnesses attempt to nullify the bill of sale by means of testimony in another written document, for example, by signing the preemptive declaration, then this preemptive written document can come and weaken the later written document, i.e. the bill of sale. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Gemara returns to discuss the matter itself. Rav Nachman says that the witnesses who said our statement that we signed was a document of trust, they're not deemed credible. And similarly, witnesses who said our statement that we signed was accompanied by a preemptive declaration, they are not deemed credible. Presumably they're talking about an oral preemptive declaration. And Mar Bar Rav Ashi says that the witnesses who said our statement that we signed was a statement of trust, they are not deemed credible. But witnesses who said our statement that we signed was accompanied by a preemptive declaration, they are deemed credible. And what is the reason for the difference between the cases? The reason is that this document that was accompanied by a preemptive declaration may be written as it is merely written under duress. So that's why we can weaken even a written document if we have reason to believe that the written document was never valid to begin with because it was written under duress. But that document of trust may not be written. It is a false document. You shouldn't write up a promissory note before money is extended for just this reason. Testifying that they wrote it is self-incriminating, and the witnesses are not deemed credible to incriminate themselves. That's interesting. You are not credible to incriminate yourself. Just as your spouse or your child cannot testify against you, you cannot testify against yourself. Okay, and that's where we'll break off. We're kind of, we're actually halfway down page 49a. Okay, a few questions. Sounds like Sharon and Tom are having a back and forth about coerced mitzvahs, if we force someone to do a mitzvah. So Sharon says, so the midrash of Mount Sinai being held over the heads of the Israelites as they were deciding to accept the Torah, does that amount to coercion as well? So before I read Tom's answer, I would say this is like the first case that we had where we said that the court can compel a person to bring a burnt offering, and it is a valid burnt offering because it is amenable to him to make an atonement. It is amenable to him to perform a mitzvah. Likewise, if God suspended Mount Sinai over the heads of the children of Israel, this is a midrash, it's not in the Bible, but it's in the Talmud, and said, if you accept the Torah, all is well, but if not, this will be your grave. And we said, we will do and we will hear, Naseh v'nishma. And so that's how we all signed on the contract, that we are bound by the mitzvahs as Jews. So you could say, well, but that was a coerced consent. And we could answer, yeah, but it was coerced by God, who knows what's best for us. And he brought us under the wings, of the covenant between God and the Jewish people, which is such a massive, gift that God has given us. Sure, not always easy, but, we benefit from it in so many ways. And it's also God doing the coercing, who knows with absolute certainty what's best for us, that we can't prove, we would not say that that's not valid because of the case, of a guy tied to a tree selling his field, because, we can't extend human law to God, and we all benefited from having the mountain held over our head. Tom says, would any mitzvah performed for fear of punishment for not performing it also be coercion? Great question, right? So we are taught to do two things, right? We have to have ahavas Hashem and yiras Hashem, right? Or actually we say yiras shemayim. Ahavas Hashem and yiras shemayim. We are commanded to love God, and we are commanded to, and we must, develop in ourselves love of God and fear of heaven. Fear of heaven is the same as fear of God, but it's this idea that you're talking about, right? How can you say that, when we give money to charity and when we pray 3 times a day and, all the other mitzvahs that we do, if we're doing that because we're afraid that if we don't do it, we won't, get a nice place in Olam Haba, in the world to come, or that things will go bad for us in some way, then are we really freely performing those mitzvahs? Answer, same as Mount Sinai being held over our heads. God is giving us these commandments for our benefit. It really doesn't matter to God. You know what I mean? Like, God is very complete whether each of us do a mitzvah or not. So if he is threatening punishment if we don't do it, that's just like, we say to a kid, listen, you got to eat your vegetables, or, I don't know, you're not going to get your allowance this week. Why are we doing that? Because we're mean? No, obviously, because we know he needs to develop a good habit of eating healthy food. Even if he can't see it, we know it's true. So all the mitzvahs have tremendous benefit to us, even if we don't see it, even if sometimes the whip is more effective than the carrot at getting us to perform them, it's still for our good. Says Sharon, you mean like when I firmly encourage my students to bring tzedakah, to give charity to each class? And Tom says, but we are supposed to do mitzvahs out of love of Hashem, not fear of him. That's not true. That is not true. We're supposed to do it for both reasons, and we're supposed to develop both emotions. And it's interesting because you could say, well, different peoples have different chemistry, different makeup. And some people will be more responsive to, I'll do mitzvahs because I love God, and other people will be more responsive to, I'll do mitzvahs because I don't want to suffer the penalty if I don't do them. But in fact, I was just reading Rabbi Avigdor Miller on this subject. You have to develop both. Both are important. Both are commandments. Both are emotions that we have to develop in ourselves. I definitely am more responsive to loving God. I take it seriously. It says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your veriness. And I'm always working on that by literally saying out loud, I love you, God. I love you, God. Thank you, God. I love you so much. You're so kind to me. You're so patient with me. Thank you. I let you down this morning. I let you down this afternoon. Thank you for being so patient with me. Thank you for the opportunities you send my way. I love you. I love you. I'm talking like that all the time. And I mean, my relationship with God becomes so much more real because I talk about it that way, and I'm much more apt to fulfill my obligations. Nevertheless, I'm human. I have a strong, Yetzer Hara, like all humans do, evil inclination. It says to me, you went to morning services every day last week and the week before and the week before. If you missed today, what's the big deal? You went to bed really late, just sleep in. It's not so bad, And sometimes, sadly, I give in to such an urge. I try not to. If I would have a stronger yiras shamayim, a stronger fear of heaven, I'll be less likely to make such a bad choice, right? So you really want to develop both. Continues Tom, but on the other hand, there is the notion of performing mitzvahs for any reason, even a bad one, out of hope that you will someday do them out of love. Just so, right? And so maybe doing it out of love is higher than doing it out of fear, but doing it out of fear over and over and over might get you to where you're doing it out of love because you start to see how doing those mitzvahs works in your life. And Tom also says, what happens if a robber uses the money he stole to purchase something from a person who was not in any way involved in the robber's crime? Can the robber's victim claim the money that the robber paid to the uninvolved party? Fantastic question. And that's why what you could say sometimes that the robber used that money and made a valid acquisition of whatever it is that he bought, from that other person. And the one who robbed you, right, your beef is with him, not with the one who innocently bought the stolen goods. Maybe he should have known better. Or the one who sold goods to the robber. But now you're saying the robber's gone. I can't get my money back. Can I get the money back? Because it was my money that was used to purchase this thing. And you could if you could restore the product that the person sold to the robber, maybe you could get your money back. But it's going to be very difficult, right? And that's why there are certain situations where a robber, even though he robbed it, his acquisition is an acquisition that's tied to the idea of the victim despairing that he's ever going to get it back. So that chain of title, that chain of possession down the line doesn't get so muddy, and we have to try to pursue the property or the money till the ends of the world. We sort of cut it off when innocent person acquires or sells, etc. That's a very superficial answer to your question. There's a lot more nuance to it, and we will discuss that more in future pages. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night. Have a great night.